So I realized a couple weeks ago, and several weeks too late, that I needed to take a little break. A bunch of things been going on, so I took last week sort of off, and but I didn't want to miss this time here, and to enable both of those to happen, I decided I was going to preach an old sermon. Probably not old to you, though. I did see it is the very first sermon on my YouTube channel. Not even close to my very first sermon. You would not want to hear those. But it's an old sermon for me, probably not for you. And as a matter of fact, it might not even be an old passage to you. You might be unfamiliar with this passage and this story. I can remember I read through the Bible at least once before I got to college all the way through, so I had to have read it. But when I got to Old Testament class, and this story, and it's funny to call it a story, it is, but it's about a man who went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. And it's not even about that. That is that. That is the story. It's all there is to it. But I remember hearing about this in Old Testament class and thinking, I can't wait to preach a sermon on that. How cool, a guy killing a lion in a pit. Well, I had to wait almost 30 years to preach a sermon, or at least that's the way it came about. There were times I'll preach that and it just never worked out. But the time that it did, it was providential that it worked out when it did for me, and I'll share that in the sermon. And so I'm praying it's providential for someone here today, hopefully more than one person, that this is what you need to hear today about this guy in a pit on a snowy day who killed a lion. Now, it's in 1 Chronicles 11, and there's actually more to it than that for the context, and so you want to turn to that. I'll be reading from the NIV today. But to give the broader context than these verses we're going to read, the chapter starts and it's recounting David becoming the king of Israel, and then it talks about his army, and more specifically it talks about what we would call his special forces. It talks about the 3 chiefs, and then it talks about the 30 mighty men. And one of these mighty men is a guy named Benaiah. And so in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 22, it says, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's 2 mightiest warriors. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Told you that's all there was to that story. And he struck down an Egyptian who was 5 cubits tall. Although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such were the exploits of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada. He too was as famous as the 3 mighty warriors. He was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the 3. And David put him in charge of his bodyguard. Now, I think maybe you can see this, especially, I don't want to be stereotypical, but maybe a young guy, like how cool. He went down into a pit and took on a lion, and he killed this lion. And so I just always wanted to preach on this, but when I finally got ready to, again, about 30 years later, I did something that I had never done before when it came to this passage. I asked the question, why? Why did he go down into the pit to kill a lion? Because my first thought was, oh, that's so adventurous. And maybe you could say, well, it was an act of faith, him against this lion. But why did he think that lion needed killed in that pit? Well, was he just a thrill junkie? Was he's a soldier guy. You can just see this special forces type. Hey, there's a lion. I think I'll kill it. I can't imagine God would include that in a positive way in the Bible. Like, hey, here's something for us all to emulate. Let's do something just almost foolish, really, if that's just what it was. Matter of fact, you could take it even a step further than foolish. This reminded me, of something that at the time was more fresh than it is now. But back in 2006, if you're a football fan, you might remember this. Definitely if you're a Steelers fan, not that I am, but I remember the story. Ben Roethlisberger had been on the team for a little bit, and he'd already shown he was an elite quarterback. He'd won a Super Bowl with them. Well, in the offseason of 2006, he was riding his motorcycle recklessly without a helmet. He got in an accident. He didn't get hurt too bad, but it could have been much worse, and he took a lot of criticism. People said, listen, you're an important part of this Pittsburgh Steelers team. You're the quarterback. That's the important part. You're a franchise quarterback. It's what teams look for. If you look at the bottom teams in the league, they're probably looking for a quarterback or developing one, or in the Colts case, he hasn't played yet because he's injured. And so this is the key person on a team. And Ben Roethlisberger agreed. He said, you're right. He said, you know what? I will not ride my motorcycle again at all for as long as I'm a Pittsburgh Steeler, as long as I'm the quarterback. And you have to admire that in him, because it was irresponsible what he did. Well, I looked at this and I thought, here's someone who's a key member of David's army. If he was just going down into the pit to kill the lion for a thrill, that's irresponsible. God's not, certainly doesn't want us to be irresponsible. So I ask this question, why did he do it? And there's some clues here. There's some things, a theme you begin to see in this context, and that's always the key to understanding things. Look again at verse 22. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, a valiant fighter from Kabzeel, performed great exploits. He struck down Moab's two mightiest warriors. It says in the ESV, the heroes. So these weren't just two average soldiers. He struck down the two mightiest warriors of Moab. And then in verse 23, it says he struck down an Egyptian who was 5 cubits tall. 5 cubits is 7.5 feet. When I raise my hand up to here, the top of my hand is 7.5 feet. Wow. Going up against that guy. And look what it says. The Egyptian here, although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand. Now, a weaver's rod was part of a loom. It's about 2.5 inches in diameter. And to give you the idea of that, if you're familiar with a baseball bat, you don't have to be good at using it. I never was. But there's the part you hold on to. Well, there's the part you hit with. This would be holding on to the part you hit with. That was his spear. Tells you about this guy. He had this spear in his hand. Well, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. So you look at that, and here's the thing. When you look at the exploits of the other 30 and the 3, the things that they emphasize are the numbers of the people. One time a person kills 300 in one battle. Another killed 300. One guy doesn't tell how many he killed with his sword, but it says his sword, literally his hand was frozen around it. He'd held it so tightly for so long. And so they're focusing on all the people they killed. But here, the difference is, it only lists 3 people that Benaiah killed. But these 3 people, they would have been on the mighty men list of their country. The mightiest warriors of Moab. This giant from Egypt. And, I thought about this, and you can think of maybe some battle scenes you've seen in movies. Chronicles of Narnia has it, Lord of the Rings has it, where there's this one warrior that stands out above everyone else. And it's sort of the idea, who's going to take him on? Which one of us is going against him? And someone does, of course. And if you think about that, what comes to mind in the Bible? You have Goliath. And he's calling out to the people of Israel, who's going to face him? And no one's stepping up. Well, Benaiah, in at least 2 incidents, if the 2 guys were the same, 3 if it were different times with Moab, he said, I'll go. And I looked at that and I thought, there's an element of him taking them on. That also means if he took them on, someone else didn't have to. So there was a thought there. It seems like, well, maybe he's doing this, to do it, but maybe he's protecting other people in some way. Could that be part of this? And then you get the context. That's the context for this story, the beginning of it. He went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. Now, the New Living Translation says he chased a lion down into a pit. That's not what it literally says. It wasn't like he was chasing after the lion. It was there. The lion was in the pit when he saw this. Well, think about it. What's the significance of that? A lion in a pit. If he's in the pit, he probably can't get out of the pit, right? And it does say it's a snowy day, so by adding that detail, it seems to be conveying this lion fell into the pit. He can't get out of the pit. That's not where he wants to stay. Not like he just hopes. He's not like a spider. I hope something comes along and falls into my lair here. Well, he couldn't get out there. So what is the danger? You think about this situation. Well, if the lion fell into the pit on the snowy day, someone else could fall into the pit. And what's going to happen to almost anyone else who falls into a pit with a lion? Unless they've removed a thorn from his paw in the past, the lion is going to devour this person there. And so it seems maybe even here, Benaiah sees that and realizes, and does it to protect other people. Now, I'm still, when I was first going over this, like, well, how do you know that? Is that the case? But you look at the rest of this passage then. Verse 25, the second part, says, and David put him in charge of his bodyguard. What's a bodyguard do? Protects people, don't they? Yeah, they guard bodies. Live ones, not dead ones. They protect people. And so you see this theme here. Benaiah went to extraordinary lengths to protect people, and David looks at that, hears about it, says, I want this guy protecting me. Even back then, the important people had bodyguards. David had a bodyguard. He says, I want him protecting me. And so I think you look at it that way, and it's why I emphasize, read the good book like a good book. It doesn't come out and say it, but it shouldn't have to. We read this and see, well, here's this theme of him protecting people. And so when he went down into that pit, it was not an adventure. It was not a thrill junkie seeking, again, just something exciting. And it wasn't even just an act of faith in terms of, hey, I'll trust God that he can, help me kill this lion. Because we've said before, if God doesn't lead you to do it, it's not faith. It's presumption. To say, I'm going to do this, now God, help me do it. So there had to be some reason there, a good reason to do it. And it seems like he was trying to protect people. And that's why he went down into this pit. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves is, will I go down into the pit to protect other people? Will I do this for other people? And some of us are saying, yeah, if there's a lion, you bet. Because there's a little bit of a thrill junkie to us too. But as often is the case, when it talks about, protecting others, there's a spiritual dimension. And first of all, the thing to realize is it's protect others, not just help others. Certainly we need to help others, but protect means what? What does protecting imply? Danger, exactly. Not just a difficulty, but a dangerous situation that they need protection from. Well, oftentimes the Old Testament physical examples have spiritual applications. And I think it's significant that the animal in a pit was a lion. It tells us David killed lions and bears. Could have been a bear. It was a lion. And 1 Peter 5:8 says, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. I think what we're to get from this is protecting others from spiritual dangers. And it was interesting. Ed said sometimes you hear the sermon, you're like, oh, someone else needed to hear this. Well, in this case, it's a little bit different today. Someone else may have needed you to hear this. Someone else may be facing some spiritual dangers. What are those dangers? Well, as I was preparing for this initially, I listened to a sermon, and a person had a couple interesting thoughts. He said that Moab in the Old Testament often represents our sinful nature, or our flesh, as some translations call it, that part of us still, even after we become a Christian, that is still drawn towards sin, that we have to resist. We have to feed the new man, to put to death the old man. And the reason for that is that our flesh is a part of us, but not the inner us. Well, Moab was a part, in a sense, related to the children of Israel. The children of Israel came from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, name changed to Israel, 12 tribes. Well, Moab came from Abraham's nephew Lot. So they were like related, but they weren't the children of Israel. And so that idea of this other part of us, sometimes it represents that. And then Egypt in the Old Testament often represents the world or sight. I can see how things will be. Abram, when he first, got to the promised land and there was a famine, what did he do? Went down to Egypt because there wasn't a famine there. They had the Nile River. And so I can see how things will be okay. And he wasn't trusting God. And whether that's true or not, that's what those are meant to convey, they're definitely true that those are spiritual dangers. The Bible talks about our sinful nature. Galatians 5:19-21 says, when you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outburst of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Wow. And you look at those and you might gravitate toward the extreme ones. Well, idolatry and sorcery, I have not committed those. Can't even remember the last time. I'm good. But look at the other things on this list. These are like everyday temptations: hostility, quarreling, jealousy, anger, selfish ambition, envy. Those are things we face and we're tempted with every day. That old part of us still wants some of that. I made a commitment to Christ if I'm a believer, but there's still a part of me that's drawn toward that I have to resist. That's a spiritual danger. And then the world, 1 John 2:15 and 16 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. And again, it's not the world in general, it's the negative side of those that draw us away from God. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, there's that sinful nature, and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. Again, God created the world, but it's using this word in the things that are opposed. They're sight versus faith. And it's not even always the negative sinful things. It's just, I can see how I'll get by this way with worldly provisions, worldly resources, versus trusting God and not seeing it. No. And so this is a spiritual danger we face, and it's real. John is writing to Christians, and he says, do not love the world. Well, why does he have to say that? Because he knows it's possible for Christians to love the world. Even as believers, to still be drawn to that, to want to focus on the things of the world, to rely on the world and the things I see versus God. Peter talks about it. He says, dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners to keep away from worldly desires that wage war against your very souls. It's not just little things. It's like this can affect you. And Paul gives an example. He says in 2 Timothy, Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me. He was so drawn to it. So he didn't resist the pull of it, and he deserted Paul in his ministry. We don't know, did he desert Christ? So the danger there is real. This part of me that still wants the things that are selfish and sinful. This part of me that sees the world out there and says, yeah, that looks pretty good. That is a danger to everyone. Satan is trying to use those to pull people away from God. I need to be aware of that and willing to help them. Well, I thought about it. Those, perhaps are ones that come more directly from that. But what are some other dangers that people face that we need to be aware of? And the next one that came to mind was false worldviews. And a worldview is just what it sounds like. It's how I view the world in general, foundationally. Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the elementary principles of this world rather than on Christ. We saw this when we went through there, the elementary principles of this world, the ABCs, and it's of how we relate to the world and, God in some sense when it comes to the spiritual side. But the basic elementary principle, the basic worldview is, do I believe there's a God or not? That is the main distinction in life. How do I view the world? Through a lens that says there is no God, in which case I believe life just happened, it was an accident. It has no real meaning or purpose, or I believe there is a God, so there's a creator, there's a purpose. And the other key implication of this, if I don't believe in God, then I don't believe in absolutes. That there is nothing absolutely right, absolutely wrong, absolutely all the time. I believe that, whatever feels good, whatever's best, whatever the majority, whatever doesn't hurt people, all those things, versus there are right and wrong principles. And this one is just so endemic in our world today, and people don't even realize it. They just don't even stop and think when they say things. My wife, when we were in Arizona, was teaching for a while, and there was a seminar. Someone came in to give some teaching on teaching, how to be a better teacher. Well, this person gave her presentation, all these things you should do, not do, whatever, and then someone asked a question, and in the course of answering the question, the presenter of this seminar said, well, there is no right or wrong in this. And my wife shared that with me, and the funny thing was, I shared it with my oldest daughter, who was 14 at the time, and her response, well, that's stupid. Even she knew that's stupid. There is right and wrong. And even this person would say, if I were to say, okay, I'm a teacher and the student isn't catching the material and said, listen, you idiot, I've told you 3 times. I'm guessing the presenter would say, yeah, that's wrong. But this is so ingrained in her mind, it just comes out without thinking, well, there is no right or wrong. Yeah, there is. Yeah. But it's just become a part of our culture, this view. And even for some people who do believe in God, it's seeped into that. This is a false worldview that is so prevalent and so dangerous there. And there's also a false spiritual worldview that, again, you can believe in God. And this one, and this came up in Sunday school this morning, this is the heart of things. It's Galatians 3. Paul talks about it. He says, "Oh, foolish Galatians." He doesn't usually tell people that, but he's telling them here. "Who has cast an evil spell on you?" I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Again, not always my favorite, but I love what they put here. "For the meaning of Jesus' death was made as clear to you as if you had seen a picture of his death on the cross." A picture's worth 1,000 words. Yeah, that's the idea here. You know exactly about his death and what it should mean to how you live your life. Let me ask you this one question. Did you receive the Holy Spirit by obeying the law of Moses? He says, of course not. You received the Spirit because you believed the message you heard about Christ. And what was the message? He died for your sins. He offers it freely by grace. Well, they weren't living that way. They thought, I'm saved by grace, but now that I'm a believer, a Christian, I relate to God based on my works. Paul's saying no. And he's not just saying no, he's saying no. This is serious. How serious? Well, look what he says in Galatians 1:9. He says, as we have already said, he said it before. So now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let him be eternally condemned. Wow. You think of all the other things Paul faced. All the other immorality and it's false teachers of some different kinds. But he says if someone is coming to you and saying you relate to God based on your works, let that person go to hell. Why? Because if you listen to them, there's a chance you'll go there yourself. Others will be influenced. Others will come to relate to God based on works versus grace. And Paul says later, you can do that, but it goes back to the same standard. You have to be absolutely perfect. You don't want that. Let the people who are telling you to relate to God based on works, let them be condemned. Because that's so dangerous, that spiritual worldview. And then I thought some more, and one of them came to mind, and my first thought was, really? It was discouragement. I thought, does that really merit inclusion here? I'm talking about the sinful nature and the world and, no grace and no God, and then discouragement. It just seems like anticlimactic. But look what it says in Psalm 22. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We're familiar with Jesus quoting that on the cross, but this is when David originally wrote it, and he was going through something. Look what he says. He feels forsaken. "Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish, crying out to God? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest." This is not David saying, "Oh, I had a bad day yesterday." This is in the pit of despair and discouragement and feeling like God isn't there, He's not listening, He doesn't care. That's bad. And sometimes people are going through that. That's the lion in the pit. That's what the lion is using with them. And so, again, what this is talking about is people around us face spiritual dangers of different types. Are we willing to go into the pit to protect them? Well, how do I protect them? If I want to do it, how do I do it? And I thought about it. Well, let's, see each of these we just looked at. Let's reverse the order. The discouragement. Okay, well, if someone's discouraged, I need to encourage them. But just as important as realizing discouragement is not, oh, I had a bad day. Encouragement is not, hey, have a good day. Have a nice day. Look what Paul says in Romans 1. He says, he's writing, he'd never been to Rome, the church there. He says, I long to see you that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. You think Paul is saying, I long to get to Rome so I can say to you, have a good day. And you can say to me, have a good day. Because you know what? All these shipwrecks I face and these beatings and people trying to kill me, if you would just tell me to have a good day, it'd all be better. No, he's saying, I want to encourage you. I want to share with you. Yes, I've been shipwrecked. Yes, I've been beaten, all this stuff. But guess what God did in the midst of those situations? And you'll say, wow, what an awesome God. And I want to hear what's been happening in your life, the difficult times and how God has come through for you. And then I can have some encouragement. I can realize, okay, God, I can get through these things. You've gotten them through. I can encourage you. That's what he's talking about there. It's so much more than have a nice day. Twice in Romans, encouragement is linked to perseverance. What do we persevere in? Our Christian faith itself, staying faithful and true to Christ. Encouragement helps us do that. The word for encouragement is to call alongside for help. It's not to call from across the room, have a good day. It's to get with that person and hold them arm in arm and walk with them. Prop them up, whatever they need. That's how I help protect someone against discouragement. Well, what about these false worldviews? I need to teach them. I need to admonish them, Colossians says. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing each one another in all wisdom. And I'd say, well, I'm not a teacher. Well, we can all teach to some degree. Teaching and admonishing one another. There's things I know I can share with you. You can share with me. We can share with each other. And admonish, that's the idea of cautioning. Reminding, urging someone to do what they've committed to do. But notice it says in all wisdom. You're a little bit like the teacher thing. You know, you don't say to someone who's struggling, listen, you idiot. You know, you call that Christian behavior? That's not very wise because they aren't going to listen. It reminds me, speak the truth in love. Teach and admonish with all wisdom. That's what I need to do if that's their problem. And then if they have given in to the sinful nature and the allure of the world, I need to restore them. Galatians 6:1 says, if someone is caught in a sin, you who live by the Spirit should restore that person gently. They're caught in a sin. It's got a hold on them. They've given in to it. You need to restore them, which might mean confronting them. But again, gently, in love, with all wisdom. That's what I need to do. And of course, if we're talking about a spiritual battle, I've got to be praying. You know, who are we fighting? Who's the lion? It's Satan. And so Ephesians 6 says, finally, be strong in the Lord and in His mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Now, maybe you look at that list and you think, hey, I've done those. I've encouraged people. I've prayed for people. I've shared some things. I've done this. But you know one thing about today's passage here? Benaiah went down into the pit. Have you gone down into the pit to do these things? Now, what's that mean? I think it gives a description of, you know, the level of commitment and involvement there. Benaiah, it's interesting in the story, he didn't throw a spear from above down at the lion, did he? He went down into the pit. Now, you might ask, why did he do that? Why not throw a spear from above? And the only clue we have is verse 23. It says, although the Egyptian had a spear like a weaver's rod in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. Well, you say, well, why? I don't know. Maybe he was a club guy. You know, it sort of made me think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They all got their specialty. You know, you got the sai and the nunchucks and the staff and the sword. That's just what they do. Well, Benaiah was a club guy. It's what he was good at. And so to go down after this lion, he had his club. I don't know, but he went down in the pit. That much we know. And as we look at a lesson for us, we have to go down into the pit. And so not only am I willing to help and even protect others, but am I willing to go down into the pit to do that? And again, the key is the level of commitment. You know, to stand on the edge of that pit and throw a spear down, well, you know, anyone could do that eventually. You know, you have enough spears, you're probably going to get the lion. But to go down in, that's a different matter, isn't it? You're putting everything on the line there when you do that. And so think about these things. Again, yeah, have I encouraged someone Well, if I've just said have a nice day, not too much. If I've really gotten there with them for a little bit, okay. But to walk alongside as long as it takes, whatever it takes, whenever it takes. Have you gotten some of those calls in the middle of the night? Does someone know that they can call you in the middle of the night? And you'll go down in the pit to encourage them. Think about the teaching and admonishing. Someone is getting caught up in these false worldviews, and your first thought, well, I don't know enough to be able to help them. Well, guess what? Find out. Go down into the pit. Put forth the effort to do what it takes to help them. And even praying. I know we all pray. We've got the prayer list. Every church has a prayer list. Every church should. We all pray. But do we pray, go down in the pit prayers? Ephesians 3:16-19. Paul says, I pray that out of his glorious riches, God may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power, together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. You realize that's a prayer? Sort of puts my prayers to shame. God, be with John. Help him. God, be with Mary. God, be with Joe. Be with Rob. Be with Beth. I can pray about 20 people a minute. Just roll them right off there, can't you? But look at this prayer. That's a pit prayer, isn't it? Praying that for someone. Praying that for the person who needs it. Am I willing to go down into the pit? And again, it's the extent of this commitment. And the first one is just effort. It takes some effort. If it was just fun, if he went down there for an adventure, there's not much of a lesson. He went down there to protect. That takes some effort. It takes some time. It takes time for me to do that. That right there shows commitment. And the obstacles to both of these, well, one is our priorities. I would, but I've got other things I'm doing. Maybe important, maybe not. I thought about, you can't go down in the pit if you won't get off the couch. I've got to make it a priority. And that attitude, I've got to have an attitude of selflessness that says, yeah, there's something else I might rather do. This is difficult. I would really not like to do this, but I will. Because of who we're talking about also. Think about it. Who was it that was most in danger? First of all, and here's where we're starting to get some, all right, well, maybe. But where would anyone be most likely to be most of the time? That he would come across this pit. Where is it a place most of us spend most of our time? At home and at work, right? Well, I thought about it. His work would be the camp, his army camp, and those would be his brothers there, his brothers in arms that would be in danger of falling into the pit, and not every soldier probably would be able to take on a lion. And so I think if that's where he saw it, he realized that, and thought, wow, what would happen to the average guy who fell down there into the pit? Wasn't prepared. Didn't decide to go down there. Who knows if he had his club with him? Suppose you have the club with you most of the time, right? And he chose, what if someone just fell in there, didn't have anything? What if they even had something? And so I think he's saying there, and it makes us think definitely, other church members, other family members, church leaders. Paul says in Romans, I appeal to you, brothers, by our Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to strive together with me in your prayers to God on my behalf. Paul's saying, please pray for me. And we might, well, you're the Apostle Paul. You pray for others. He's like, pray for me. We need to be praying for each other. We need to be praying for church leaders. And then the other place that he might have seen this pit, be around his house somewhere. Imagine what went through his mind if that was the case. He sees this pit, he sees this lion, it's a snowy day, and he realizes, hey, my kids play around here. Hey, this is where my wife picks berries or whatever she did. What would happen to them if they fell down in the pit? And he knew exactly what it would be. And so you look at that, and I think, well, now we're committed, right? Now I will go down into the pit to protect other people. I don't know if that's the case or not. This story of Benaiah might be new to you. How many people had heard of or remember the story of Benaiah prior to today? Yeah. The story's new, but the concept isn't, right? Do you see how many verses I put on this sheet? This idea of protecting, of looking out, of encouraging, of teaching, and that's not new at all. We've all heard that before. But how much have we done it? And I'll tell you, how much had I done it prior to this? Not very much. Not very much at all. And I think the reason, again, it's just for whatever reason, it's not a priority. We're not being selfless. Well, how do we change? How do we always change and be transformed? We renew our mind, right? Well, to do that, we need to grasp the danger. This is a danger to people I know and love, and it's an eternal danger. You know, it says in 1 Peter 5:8, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, what? Looking for someone to devour. Now, every attack of Satan doesn't lead to us being devoured, but that's his goal. He wants to take us as believers and cause us to lose our salvation, to give up on our salvation, to turn our back on God. This is too tough. I'd rather do this. This looks good and better than God. Whatever it is, that's his goal. That's his purpose, to separate us from God for eternity. That's why in Galatians it says, let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living that sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God. If you give in to these things he was talking about in Galatians, you will not spend eternity with God. This has eternal stakes here as we talk about this. A worldview that denies absolutes ultimately denies God. You're not going to spend eternity with him then. A works view denies grace. Paul says if you totally give in to that and relate to God on works, you won't spend eternity with God. And even discouragement. Well, hey, but look what it says in Hebrews 3:13. Encourage one another daily so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. You can get so discouraged that sin deceives you into thinking there's no hope, there's no reason, there's no God. He doesn't care. Even that can have eternal consequences. So what's at stake? The eternal fate of who? People closest to us. People we know here in this room, people we know from other churches, people in our family. And this is what got me into the pit. Now, I mentioned the providence of it being this time. My girls had gotten to the age, again, Charlie was 14, Darren was 11. And Charlie, she's a thinker, she's a reader, she's also an artist. We just started sending her to art school. We love that side of it. We hated the fact that everyone there was absolutely relativistic. And Charlie, who heard that story about the teacher saying, well, there is no right or wrong here, and said, that's stupid. She didn't recognize it with some other things. She'd hear some things from her friends or her teachers and didn't stop to think about it. And Lisa and I, we started to recognize that and said, yeah, we need to be careful about that. My youngest daughter, she struggles with anxiety, depression, but it would manifest itself in anger a lot of times. And we start to see that come out. And like, yeah, we need to be careful about that. And you know what I did, my response? If you were to put it metaphorically, not only did I not go down in the pit, I didn't even throw a spear. I flipped the rock over my shoulder. Well, I hope it hits the lion in an eye. I just really didn't do anything until both of those came to a head and I realized my daughters are in eternal jeopardy. These things that they're facing could tear them, pull them away from God. And I started getting down into the pit. Started praying like never before. I started having conversations. I started watching my own example. My daughter gets angry, I can get angry. I found out it doesn't work real well to say, quit getting angry. Go figure. And so I had to change myself in different ways. That took the effort, the commitment. That was the getting down into the pit part. And I'm guessing there's someone here today, or more than one, that God, this is His time for you to hear this because there's someone around you in danger. And it's time for you to get down in the pit. Whatever that means for that person, that danger. And so what do I need to do now? Well, ask yourself, who is in danger? Everyone to some degree, because Satan's prowling around. He's looking at everyone, any chance. But you might have someone specifically in mind this morning. Who is in danger, and what do they need? Do they need that encouragement, that walking alongside? Do they need the teaching? Do they need the restoring, the prayer? And if so, are you praying like someone's life depends on it? Not be with Joe, and be with Rob, be with Mary. And then lastly, what am I going to do now? Here's who it is. Here's what they need. What am I going to do? And don't forget that example part. Not just restore, confront, not just encourage, but maybe I need to be the example. And I don't even realize, again, how many parents yell at their kids not to yell? And we don't realize. Stop and look. What am I doing? What's my example to these people? And lastly, maybe you're the one that's in spiritual danger this morning. Maybe it's you. This sermon is about who is in spiritual danger that I need to protect. Maybe you're the one, in whatever way that Satan has really been attacking. Maybe you're the one that hasn't made that first decision for whatever reason, that false worldview of God or that false worldview of works like, hey, I'm not that bad. No, the Bible says if you sin one time, you're as guilty as if you had broken every law that God has. It's all or nothing. You're either saved or you're not. And if you've reached the age where you know right and wrong, you're not, if you haven't personally accepted Christ. And so as we have our time of decision and invitation, it's a chance for all of us to make one decision or the other. What am I going to do with what I've heard right now?